Hello and welcome to the University of Pittsburgh, to the university's European Union Center of Excellence and European Studies Center's 7th video conversation on Europe. We have done, as that number indicates, several of these this year on a number of topics, including the future of NATO, Germany's place in Europe, the future members of the EU like Croatia, current members of the EU like Ireland. My name is Ron Linden. I'm director of the center, and I'm happy to welcome you here and to welcome our partners who are here remotely. University of Illinois, you can see who's who up there. And that's Illinois, okay. And hi, Matt.
Hello. Hi, Ron.
And University of North Carolina, who are right. I see Erica. Hi, Erica. Okay. We are also being joined remotely by some of our panelists, whom I will introduce in a moment. I want to begin by thanking especially Alison Delnor, who does all the heavy lifting to make this work, both in terms of contacts, logistics, and the technology, which we hope will keep working during the course of this event. Before I begin with today's event, I want to announce our next upcoming event, which is a conference on the changing security environment of the Black Sea. It will take place here in Pittsburgh, May 1st to 3rd. We'll cover a number of topics related to the Black Sea, democratization, military changes, economics, energy, and you are all welcome to attend. In his State of the Union address, President Obama announced the start of negotiations between the United States and the European Union on leading towards a transatlantic trade and investment pact, a TTIP, or more generally referred to as a free trade agreement. Most people are surprised to find out that we don't already have one with Europe, given the high level of trade and mutual economic interdependence. In fact, if people pay attention to free trade agreements at all, they might be familiar with NAFTA or maybe the more recent agreements, but they're relatively unfamiliar with the situation, with the status of the situation with Europe. And we need to look into this a little more closely because there are both complicated, specific building blocks of an agreement, some of which I'll address in a moment, and there are broader aspects. And it is, as all issues are in this field, fairly complex. And so we need guides, and I've been able to recruit some outstanding guides to join us, whom I would like to introduce now. To my left is Ambassador J.D. Bindenagel, who is currently Special Advisor to the President of DePaul University in Chicago. So he had to come here so he could talk to people in Illinois, evidently. He retired after a long career as ambassador spent in all kinds of Germany, East, West, and United. After that, he was in charge of the U.S. Embassy Investment Advocacy Program in Germany, and then was appointed by President Cleeton as U.S. Ambassador for Holocaust issues. He has a complex career that has involved a number of areas, including negotiating a conflict diamonds agreement. And he is here courtesy of the American Council on Germany and the Pittsburgh World Affairs Council. And we thank them and our own board member, Dave Murdoch, for helping to bring Ambassador Bindenagel here today. To my right is my colleague, Martin Staniland, Professor of International Affairs and Director of the International Affairs Program at the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs. He has had a couple of careers. One started out as an Africanist and now a Europeanist, and he has worked in particular on issues of regulations regarding airlines. Publications include, most recently, A Europe of the Air, the Airline Industry and European Integration, and Regulating Aircraft Emissions, Leadership and Market Power in the Journal of European Public Policy. His BA, MA, and PhD are from the University of Cambridge. Professor Cleeton, we hope to be joined, so I'll introduce him so it won't take time later, by Professor David Cleeton, who is at Illinois State University. He is currently at a conference and promised to plug in via whiz-bang technology. We hope he does. He has a PhD from Washington University and specializes in finance, especially finance regulation, and is the author most recently of a chapter called Evaluating Performance Record Under the Lisbon Agenda in a volume on the European Union after Lisbon. Joining us from France, we hope, by audio only, Professor Zaki Laïdi from Sciences Po, which is our partner university. We have sent on both undergraduates and GISPIA students to Sciences Po. He is a professor there and director of research at their Center for International Studies, and is the author most recently of a volume called The World According to Obama, and EU Foreign Policy in the Globalized World. And he certainly has an article which has one of the best titles I've heard, and probably I'll steal it myself, called BRICS, B-R-I-C-S, you all know what that is, and mortar. Professor Laïdi, can you hear us?
Yes.
Good, I'm very glad. Apparently, non-tariff barriers have prevented the importation of webcams into France, so we are stuck with audio. Finally, Ben Beachy is joining us from Washington, where he is research director with Public Citizens Global Trade Watch. In that capacity, he focuses on, in particular, U.S. trade policy and its impact on jobs, and has previously spent a lot of time working on the impact of trade, aid, and lending policies to Latin America. When we begin our discussion, which I promise momentarily, the technology will kick in, we hope, and I will be able to ask questions to recognize that you want to speak. My panelists want to speak. Some of them are right beside me, others will indicate. And Professor Laïdi can indicate by sending a quick message to Allison, who will indicate to me. I'd like to set the stage briefly by laying out what's at stake and raising the question of what's at stake here. Why are we talking about this? Why are we spending time on this issue? First, of course, there is the sheer size of U.S.-European trade and economic connections. 50%, by some estimates, of global GDP, 1/3 of world trade accounted for by the U.S.-European dyad, 2/3 of global banking, and 3/4 of the world's financial system. And thanks, by the way, to Dan Hamilton of the SAIS Center for Transatlantic Relations for their annual volumes on U.S.-European economic ties. But trade only tells part of the story, of course. European investment accounts for 70% of all foreign direct investment in the United States. U.S. investment in Europe is more than 14 times all of the investment in the aforementioned BRICS. U.S. investment in Ireland, for example, is 6 times U.S. investment in China. U.S. investment in Europe in the last couple of years has grown, while U.S. investment in China has declined. At the state level, 45 of the 50 states export more to Europe than they do to China. Pennsylvania is the 10th leading exporter to EU, accounting for more than $10.5 billion worth of trade, and Illinois is 5th, accounting for more than $13 billion. This translates into some 7.5 million jobs that are supported by investment or trade in Europe. Estimates vary, but the suggestion is that a free trade agreement between the United States and Europe might account for as much as 3.5% increase in GDP, or as the European Commission said, the equivalent to a full Austrian or Danish economy. Like free trade agreements before it, tariffs will be a crucial issue, especially, and I imagine we will get into this, on agricultural goods. But there are some key differences that will come up with regard to this free trade agreement. For example, trade in goods only accounts for 20% of the exchanges between Europe and the United States, and services, which are likely to be and supposed to be included in this agreement, are crucial. And one of the questions I'm going to pose to our panelists is what the issues are and how they might or might not be resolved. Non-tariff barriers, including especially issues of regulation, including of those services like financial services, insurance, and telecom, are likely to be part of this agreement. In addition, regulation affecting key commodities. There can't be anybody in this room who hasn't heard about the issue of GMOs, for example. There are also sanitary issues, issues of standards and testing. In addition, of course, there are issues that have to do with both regulation and exchange in data. What kind of data privacy rules will be included? What kind of rights will airlines have to fly within each other's domestic market? How open will the public procurement market be? Those issues form the sort of grist of these, are likely to form the grist of these negotiations. But there are two broader issues which I hope we'll touch on as well. One is the question of trade overall and its relationship to global trade. Is this a deal that's just a deal between rich partners? And is this a deal which, if consummated, hurts global trade? Especially the post-war movement towards global trade, emblemized by the World Trade Organization. One commentator wrote that bilateralism, which this clearly is, undermines the few functioning global policy institutions. Multilateral rules lose their relevance in a world where bilateral agreements come to dominate. On the other hand, Stuart Eisenstadt, former ambassador to the EU, says that this concern is false. He writes, far from undercutting the WTO multilateral trade regime, which has hopelessly stalled, a successful TTIP can create positive pressures. And I will ask our panelists to comment on that. More broadly, we have to keep in mind the question of how important this is to the overall US-EU relationship. Is it one that will go on anyway? Is it crucial to the continuation of the broader political and military relationship? You can imagine a scenario, for example, where agricultural issues poison the atmosphere, and those who are inclined to bash Europe anyway, and we have many in the United States, will take that as an example that we should not pursue this. We should not go forward. And, as we all know, President Obama has himself announced a U.S. policy characterized as a pivot towards Asia. What does that mean, and how does this relate? And I have about 6,000 other more issues that need to be raised, but I'm going to allow our panelists to do so. I first raise the question and open it to any of our panelists to the broader question of how important is this trade agreement, or is it mostly hype? Mr. Ambassador.
Ron, I'd be delighted to start this conversation. I'd like to start from the last point that you made, the strategic relationship, what's important, why are we doing this? And it's very clear, at least to me, that there are tremendous reasons in tackling the recession and the unemployment issues that we have. When the president made his announcement was we are engaged in what the State Department pronounces this acronym TIP. The TTIP will provide growth and jobs. Now, that is important for us as we look at in the United States. We have had a stimulus at the beginning to fight off the Great Recession. And then since then, we've been focused on deficits. So our policy is not in growth or jobs. And we, as you all know, as students and young people, this is critical for the next part of our economy where we're going to go. On the European side, the Eurozone's economic problems, its sovereign debt problems, have resulted in policy of austerity. What does that mean? That means that in Spain, 40-50% unemployment in youth. They're not addressing the same issues of growth and unemployment that we have the same issues for both of us. How do you attain growth and reduce unemployment? But Ron, you noted that it's a very large market. We're a huge market. You could argue that 50% of global output in dollar terms is contained in this agreement. So if you come together and you create a growth, even if it's not as large as you would hope, 0.5% to 1.5%, if it's half of the world's trade, then you can make a tremendous difference in growth and jobs. And that, I think, is one of the major motivations for a Democratic president announcing a trade agreement where traditionally the constituencies of the Democratic Party, labor, environment, have been those that have sought to block that kind of agreement. In this case, Europeans might be somewhat ahead of us in labor issues, might be somewhat ahead of us in environmental issues, and those two constituencies are not there. The Republican side of the House is very important. The United States Trade Representative, the White House, has announced to Congress our intention to do this negotiation, and it goes to a Republican-led House of Representatives that has traditionally been in favor of trade agreements. So we already have a political basis for addressing these issues, a very strong constituency, and something that I have not seen in the last 20 years of following this free trade agreement discussion. We have a lot of public support for this agreement. I think that is important to know. Why are we doing this? And so if that is the motivation to address some of the issues that Ron raised, that is a question. That's strong enough to deal with the mutual recognition of regulations or reducing tariffs. And while I think it's important to note that while the tariff levels generally or on average are very small, there's some sectors of the economy that are very large. Agriculture, automobiles, chemicals, pharmaceuticals, these are industry areas that have higher tariffs than the average, and they offer an opportunity for growth in that. As an opening point, I would just say, first of all, it's a very important relationship, and it's based on rule of law and democracy and values that we have, and a very strong economic argument.
Thank you. Martin.
Let me address a couple of questions, somewhat similar to Ron's that seem to me pertinent. One which you did raise is how this prospective agreement fits into a larger pattern, or the larger pattern of EU trade. Second one, what does it say about larger trends and problems in the international trade system itself? Let me just point out a couple of things. One is to do with the United States. This is a small point, but it is interesting that if you read the background and recent statements on it, it is suggested quite strongly that this is an initiative that, while it came from the United States, was not a great initiative on the part of the president, that in fact this item was put into the State of the Union message at the very last moment. And this sort of confirms a bit the, I'll say, traditional established view of him as being not so interested in Europe. Two quick points. One thing that was reported recently, which is relevant to this, and it was reported in the back of The Economist, is what's been happening in trade between developing countries. And there were some interesting statistics came out, I think, of the World Bank, which pointed out that since early this year, the balance of trade has been affected by the increasing amount of trade, not in cheap labor-intensive goods, but in medium-intensive technology goods between South countries, South-South trade. So what we've got is middle-income countries like the BRICS, and that they have now reached a point in terms of incomes where they are starting to trade more, instead of in raw materials, or not at all in raw materials, but in cheaper labor-intensive things, and beginning to become an alternative market in a way for industrialists in their own area. The question would be how far, as far as the EU is concerned, I would think, how far this is going to cause kind of trade diversion away from things the EU sends out. The second thing that's interesting, and it follows exactly on what Ron said about what this says about the state of multilateralism. And for those who don't know this, probably not many here, but what has happened is, as you said, and everybody says, that Doha has been a kind of disaster and incomplete. But the United States, when the EU started to swing away, despite the EU's, say, traditional attachment to multilateralism, towards bilateral agreements on a number of them, and is actually pursuing quite a number at the moment. And one of the things about this, or one of the points about this, is that obviously it reflects a disenchantment which is fairly widely shared about the WTO. But one of the more interesting strategic observations I've come across in preparing this is that it may be that from the point of view of both the EU and the United States, the creation or a concentration on this, as has been said, very important market in which they already have many relations, could be a way of bypassing the problems that the United States and others have run into, particularly with China, but not only with China, during the Doha negotiations. In other words, you can create one great big bloc. To some extent, that would enable you to, say, move around the very strong kind of problems that have emerged there. And those, I think, are the main things. I'm not clear from my reading just how far you can read anything into this shift in terms of the larger United States strategic position, which we all know is supposed to be a pivot towards Asia. Because the Asian section remains very important, and there's certainly a very big negotiation going on between ASEAN and other countries. So we have a lot of creation, or a lot of effort going into creation of regional markets. And some people, it's true, say, well, this could have a positive impact for the WTO. I'm not quite clear why that would happen. But I suppose you could say if it raises the agenda, raises the level of attention to trade issues, that it could go in that direction. I think I'll just throw those cues.
Thank you, Mark. Professor Laïdi, since I can't see you, I want to invite you to join in at this moment, especially since we're dealing with the issue of wider trade negotiations upon which you've written. Apparently not. Right. Mr. Beachy, you've also dealt with this issue of why, especially with the trade between the sort of richer North and the poorer South. And where do you see this agreement as fitting into the global trade patterns going forward?
I would agree with a couple of the premises that were laid out, particularly by Ambassador Bindenagel. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can, yes.
Okay. Two of those are that this is a critical agreement with critical implications, and secondly, that this is a bit different from the agreements we've talked about in the past between North and South. But the reason why I would say it's critical is quite different. I would argue that this trade agreement is principally not about trade, which is not a very hard argument to make. The administration itself has struggled with the idea of actually putting the word free trade in the agreement. In the end, the official name given to it does not include the words free trade. Though we still refer to it as most of the media does as the Transatlantic Free Trade Agreement, TAFTA. It's also easier to pronounce than TTIP. The main reason why I'd say it's not about trade is because tariffs are already quite low, as we all know, between the EU and the United States. And as you already mentioned, the trade flows between the two blocs are enormous, among the most enormous in the world. And so to discuss this as a standard trade deal is not really accurate. Rather, what this is, the intent of the agreement is to really focus on, as stated by the high-level working group that actually has forged the draft text for this agreement, is to look at behind-the-border policies. That is regulatory and the non-tariff barriers that you mentioned. And so. Oh, there's Professor Cleeton.
I think so.
And so, can you still hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. All I saw was Professor Cleeton there for a second. And so the principal focus of this agreement is not on trading goods, as you mentioned. The principal agreement is actually not even on trade and services, which was also quite liberalized. The principal focus of this is on behind-the-border regulatory policies. And the words that have been used to describe the objectives of this agreement, the Transatlantic Business Dialogue is really the group that has been pushing TAFTA, a trade agreement between the United States and EU since 1995, which is part of the reason why it was not inserted into the State of the Union until the last moment, because this has not been a push principally by the Obama administration, but rather by the Chamber of Commerce of the United States and its partners in Europe, under the auspices of the Transatlantic Business Dialogue. And their agenda has largely been one that can only really be described as a dismantling of much of the regulations that they see as barriers to trade. We see that as critical because we see those regulations as critical for protecting the public interest of consumers and of workers. First of all, I would say that the very premise that it would be optimal to have regulatory convergence, to have so-called harmonization of standards, is one that we are skeptical about. Having uniform standards between the EU and the United States does not make sense if we accept that consumers in different countries have different priorities, and that insofar as those countries are democratic, those consumers express those priorities through different regulations, and that those differences should be respected and expected as the natural outgrowth of trade between democratic nations. Can
I ask you to give me an example of a standard or a regulation that you think should not be made uniform? If I get your point.
Sure. For example, I would say that right now we have I can give you four. Right now we have the National Corn Growers Association in its official comments that it submitted for a process that's been called the High Level Regulatory Cooperation Forum, which is the forum in which large businesses and several non-business groups have been able to submit comments for what they would like to see come out of this agreement. So it's very concrete. It's very much like this is what we hope. This is our objectives for the agreement. The corn growers explicitly took issue with and asked for the dismantling of the precautionary principle used in Europe, and of course, particularly with respect to GMOs. The European consumers have time and again said that they would prefer a stronger standard than the United States uses to protect consumers from the entrance of GMOs into their food system, and that is based on the precautionary principle. The National Corn Growers Association has asked that the United States negotiators use the TAFTA negotiations to substitute, to change that principle, to change that standard from precautionary principle to what we call the science-based principle, which would, I think, is a bit of a misnomer to presume that all regulations can stem from an objective sense of science. Anyway, the point is that would be an argument by U.S. agribusiness that for the dismantling of European consumer protections under this guise of regulatory convergence, under this guise of harmonization. Another one financial regulation, since I know one of our panelists is particularly keen on financial regulation, has been the EU and U.S. banks have both exchanged barbs, let's say, about each other's regulations. So the EU has expressed officially, the European Commission on behalf of EU banks, has taken issue with the Volcker rule, which is one of the key pieces of the Dodd-Frank legislation used to re-regulate Wall Street in the fallout of the financial crisis. And they, are pushing, in essence, through these negotiations for that rule to be watered down. And on the flip side, U.S. banks have explicitly taken issue with the proposal now made official by the European Commission to have a financial transaction tax. And the U.S. banks have long been pushing for that to be dismantled and see this now, these negotiations as a forum in which to get such dismantling. Did you have a question?
Okay, hold on one second. I want to welcome Professor Cleeton, who's joined us from Illinois State, as I indicated earlier. And as you can tell, we've gotten into the weeds here of these negotiations, and actually you've come at a good point because you have worked on the issue of financial transactions and financial regulations, and I'd like to invite you to join in the conversation at this point on this issue and what part it will take in the TTIP, and are the differences that Ben Beachy has just described likely to scuttle the agreement, or can they be worked out?
Well, that's one of the more problematic areas that I see. It's problematic because we are still having a long jobless recovery here. The European Union has a series of new initiatives in place for how financial services are to be regulated. The growth in financial services has cut back a great deal since the Great Recession took place. So this is not an area where there's going to be a lot of agreement moving forward in the financial system about who has regulatory powers and what those implications are going to be for the opening up of financial services trade. So I'm not optimistic that this is the margin on which a big push is going to be made, or it's going to be an area which will take much longer time to work out and implement some semblance of an agreement. So it's a problematic area.
Ambassador Bindenagel, given the importance of services, and especially financial services, if Professor Cleeton is right, either you'll get no result or it will drag on longer than the Doha round.
Let's talk about the framework of the debate. From the Europeans, and I would add to Martin's comment about the president coming lately to this issue. This is not an issue that's just here. It's been going on for 20 years. And the Europeans, I was just in Europe for the last couple of weeks last month, and they are very determined to try to set in this 18-month period, that is by the end of 2014, an agreement. The United States has talked about achieving this on one tank of gas. I'm not sure what that all means, one tank of gas. But
better than one tank of hot air, right?
The politics around whether it's longer or shorter. What you point out is that there is on both sides a time frame for the parties to come together. So that provides, as a negotiator, I will tell you, having an endpoint focuses everyone's attention. There are mechanisms, too, in this process that are very important. It's how you organize the debate that's really important. There's a trade and services debate that's going on and will be really the focal point of this debate of financial services and how these issues, which I agree are very, very difficult, will be handled. It's not going to be something across the board. This is an agreement that deals with lots of different kinds of organizations. So the TABD was mentioned, or the TBC, if you will, has been working on mutual recognition of regulations, which also includes financial regulations, for years. And they've had some success, not much. They've had success in recognition of global, they've had international accounting principles, and the GAAP principles of the United States agreed upon, that is mutually recognized, not changing either system, but recognizing that these two systems can work together. There's some e-commerce issues and some others that have worked particularly as you move to data and financial services. It's a huge effort. But there's also a lot that has changed. There's a crisis at the European Union right now, and the sovereign debt crisis, and there are changes that are happening at lightning speed. We have not seen the decisions that you've seen in the Euro crisis happen at this speed ever. And I would not argue that there isn't enough time. There is enough time. I would argue that the real question is whether you're going to harmonize. Ben was talking about harmonization of regulations. That's not going to happen. It's just too difficult, I agree. But what we're talking really about is mutual recognition of regulation. And there you have the ability, and in both cases, in financial services or in sanitary, phytosanitary, GMO issues, the ability to recognize that the domestic processes in each country are recognized by each other. This has also been a debate for 20 years. We have never achieved that. It isn't coming out of zero. It's coming out of a long-term debate. So I would argue that, yes, these are really difficult issues. They have a tremendous impact on what's happening, but the financial market is an international market. It is not a domestic market. And if you're going to have a crisis in the United States, as we have had, it will come to Europe, and it will be back and forth. There's an urgent need to have these financial services regulations on a mutual basis. I think that political will is really right there, right now, to do this in this 18-month period.
Martin, I'd like to return to the theme you raised, which actually fits with what others have suggested. In a way, and I hope I'm not misinterpreting you, you seem to be suggesting that these two big, powerful economic actors are, in a sense, running scared. That because of China, because of the growth of South-to-South trade, because they need to act together, and because of the slow economic growth on both sides of the Atlantic, in a way they have no choice but to come together.
Well, there was a very interesting, I don't know if I can find it in my notes now, there's a very interesting statement by, I'll get to it in a moment. Solana, last week in European Voice. And Solana, for those who don't know who Javier Solana is a former head of the Common Foreign Security Policy section in the EU. And he said this. He said, Europe and the United States need each other more than ever. Faced with predictions, this is the phrase that took me, faced with predictions of the West's relative decline, the US and the EU must commit themselves to more union, more cooperation, and more prosperity. Today, that means a transatlantic free trade agreement. By the way, notice the free trade agreement. So this is more, it's an idea, but it has a certain logic, and that's why I said, if you fit this in, try to fit this into a broader pattern, it does look rather defensive. I picked this up from him, but there is a logic there. And I think the sort of ambiguous point in this is what the relationship with, well, particularly China will be, because China is very important. On the other hand, there is this sense of being threatened by China. So, I mean, not that this is necessarily thought of, apart from by him, as a defensive action, but you can see how it might be regarded that way. And you've got a big given market, and you can extract some things from it. And at this point, with what's happening in both economies, which we've talked about, this would seem to be worth trying to pursue. So there are perhaps different motives, but some push as well as some pull.
Did you want to respond to that?
I'd like to make a couple of points to Martin's point. It's not so much a defensive effort as it's a strategic effort from my point of view. The president has announced a pivot to Asia. It's very important that we have our allies with us. And in that sense, the president has moved for the Trans-Pacific Partnership. That that is a very important element of this whole debate. And one of the elements that's critical there is Shinzo Abe's agreement to participate in the TPP. If you have the Trans-Pacific Partnership that has everyone but China in it, basically, but has us working then together with the Europeans and our own pivot to Asia, then you have an even larger market. And what you're doing here strategically is indeed, because of the size of the market, as I mentioned at the very beginning, the ability to try to shape some of these issues that have not been resolved in the WTO, or and certainly in Doha round is dead, but it's certainly not going anywhere. So you have the shift, and what you raised earlier is very important, because is this, and I'm sorry that Professor Laïdi is not with us, because he has a very good point about, are we undermining the multilateral system? Are we undermining WTO? And I would like to go back to the GATT Article 24, which is really very important. And bilateral and regional agreements are certainly consistent with the multilateral system, but there are some stipulations. And there are a couple of I just point out. One is, with an appropriate transition period, trade barriers and tariffs should be eliminated from substantially all trade. So if you're going to have a bilateral or a bilateral trade agreement, then it shouldn't be posing tariffs on others while you're taking them off. That's important. In terms of tariffs and non-tariff treatment, what Ben had raised, the overall burden placed on non-members should not be greater than before formation of a free trade zone. So in that case, when you talk about non-tariff barriers, excluding certain sensitive areas like agriculture or audiovisual services and other things, would actually be in danger of violating WTO rules. So you can't exclude them either. So what we have here is as you pointed out, not a trade. It's not a transatlantic trade agreement. It's much larger than that. It's a comprehensive agreement. Not been tried before. And I can tell you that when President Clinton came to Berlin in 1994 and decommissioned the U.S. forces in Berlin, there's a sense that the relationship had a void. And this is what you were talking about, is that the relationship is changing with you. And the effort was then, well, how do we manage this? I can tell you as a side note, the U.S. embassy that I was in Berlin was an effort that Ron mentioned, was to create to be the largest foreign investor in the former communist parts of Germany. The United States invested $8.5 billion in new investment in Eastern Germany, from GM to AMD to Dow, big companies, and small, medium-sized companies. This is an effort that brings in the question, you're not dealing only with trade, you have to bring in also investment. So that's the change in the debate. The next year, in 1995, at the US-EU level, we negotiated the new transatlantic agreement, an effort to try to move forward. In 2007, Chancellor Merkel made an initiative with President George W. Bush that was called the Transatlantic Economic Council. This began to deal with some of the non-tariff barriers, some of the mutual recognition of regulations that we mentioned before, and has pushed us into that discussion. So we have not been very interested in Europe, as we may have been talking about here in this center. We have considered in many cases, and I can tell you in the policy discussions I have, that the U.S. attitude has been, well, our project with Europe is finished. It was a Cold War project, and Europe is whole and free, and that project is finished. We need to go somewhere else. The pivot to Asia says to me, yeah, we should pivot to Asia. They've got nationalisms that are very dangerous. We can see North Korea. We can see the islands of the Japanese and the Chinese. We shouldn't be doing this alone. That's the underlying point. We shouldn't be doing this alone. So what are we doing? We're not talking about free trade only. We're talking about a comprehensive agreement that talks about investment and actually commits our European allies to be with us as we deal with China. China is important, but it starts from a very low base, and the trade has increased dramatically. But we're now disinvesting from China. Why are we disinvesting from China? And in 2011 was 2012 rather, was about $1.2 billion of disinvestment from China. But we invested in Europe by $224 billion. So where are we? I mean, to give you some indication. Why are we disinvesting in China? They don't have rule of law to resolve conflicts. There's a whole host of things that go with this US-EU agreement that provides a stronger position for the Chinese not to be excluded, but to be encouraged to join a system that is based on the rule of law. That's kind of the philosophy that's driving behind this. Not trying to undermine the multilateral system. It's stuck. My friend Bob Zellick has complained also and said, you know, the WTO needs to modernize. It needs to do some things to make it possible. That's what we have to negotiate. It's not a foregone conclusion. I'm not saying it's done. Those are the issues that to address very serious things you raised. Services, what Ben raised with GMOs and phytosanitary rules. These are all very critical issues that we have never resolved before. That doesn't mean we can't.
There are many issues remaining. I want to offer this opportunity to our people around this table here, as well as at Illinois, who might want to ask a question. Please indicate that you want to by raising your hand. I only ask that you get a question that you identify yourself. Evgeny.
My name is Evgeny Ponsnikov. I'm a PhD candidate at the Graduate School of International Affairs, and I'm particularly interested in labor standards in trade agreements, and this has been recently a big part of the shift towards bilateralism, labor standards. So I was wondering if you could comment perhaps on whether labor standards have been part of the debate, to what extent?
On labor standards. Professor Cleeton?
I would put labor standards in the same category as a lot of the concerns about environmental standards. There are some major areas of conflict. The one that the general populace probably knows most about is the airline emissions standards that the EU has put into place, and the pushback they've received not only from U.S. carriers but global carriers. So those issues, along with labor standard issues, are an opportunity at, again, the margin of the great breadth in which we have a potential to reach an agreement. I would recommend to the students that if they haven't, they might want to look at a recent piece that Jeffrey Schott wrote for the Peterson Institute. And what Jeffrey focuses in on is what was achieved under the Korean-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, what was achieved under the Korean-EU Free Trade Agreement, and how taking those as basic starting points, the U.S.-EU might progress in the direction of simply saying, what did we grant in a favorable way under trade, under services, and what would remain in conflict, what additional work would be needed to be done in additional areas like investment, like financial services, like the sanitary concerns. So it's a nice framework to see kind of what the most recent U.S. Liberal position in bargaining was with the Koreans, what the EU did after looking at what the U.S. had done, and using that as a template for marching through a framework to see what, if we would make the same kind of concessions in this round, what would remain points of controversy, and then we could perhaps focus more on those things. So that would be a recommendation I would have for the students, certainly. Look up the Peterson Institute. Jeffrey Schott has a piece on crafting transatlantic trade and investment partnership.
Is that S-H-O-T, like it sounds?
It is S-C-H-O-T-T, from the Peterson Institute of International Economics.
Right. Then, I'd like to sort of sharpen Evgeny's question on the following. One would find it odd to think that the issue of labor standards would be an issue between the United States and Europe, unlike a trade agreement we might have with Latin America, for example, or another country. In fact, if anything, we might have trouble adding things like paid family leave and universal health care. Oh my God, we can't go down that European road as we are so often told. So are these likely to be issues that will be part of the negotiations, and how difficult will they be?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, the unions of the United States, the AFL-CIO, for example, have actually do have something quite a bit to say about this agreement, and have put out statements that are not ex ante opposition, as was noted, but are quite skeptical, saying that the approach that has been used in the prior trade agreements, such as those that Jeffrey Schott recommends as the template, have been of a lowest common denominator approach to most regulatory standards, and in some cases to labor standards as well. The bigger fear is not that we will be asked to replicate Sweden's labor laws. The bigger concern is that Sweden will be asked to replicate our labor laws. And that is, I think, the concern that comes from groups like the AFL-CIO, and more generally is indicative of the broader concern that I was presenting at the beginning, that all of the comments thus far submitted for what this agreement should look like from the business standpoint has not been, oh, we should raise our regulatory standards, we should raise our consumer and worker protections to the level that we see on the other side of the Atlantic. It has been aggressive. It has been saying we should lower the standards we see on the other side of the Atlantic down to our level. And we see that time and again. So it's hard to say exactly what will come, particularly with regard to labor standards, if there is that same lowest common denominator approach that has been used in prior agreements. I think you'll find that this will be an increasingly contentious issue, and you'll find the same sort of opposition you've seen to prior, FTAs, such as the Korea FTA that he mentioned. I also wanted to comment real quickly, since investment was brought up, and Jeffrey Schott, thinks that the investment model used in the Korea FTA should be replicated. The investment model that used in the Korea FTA is an anomalous mechanism, and it's one of the bigger concerns that's gotten pushback from a number of consumer groups since NAFTA and throughout the entire model of these trade agreements. That system is called the investor state system, and it allows a foreign corporation, a private corporation, to directly take a sovereign government to court. It allows them to directly challenge a public policy in a tribunal that is an extrajudicial tribunal held outside of any domestic legal system. This is not even a system that the WTO endorses. It's not a system that they allow. In the WTO, if a corporation from the United States would want to pursue a claim against the EU, they would need to first convince the United States government to then pursue that claim state to state with the EU. Under this trade agreement, under the investment model that Jeffrey Schott has recommended, a private corporation can directly do that. The tribunals that see these are three-person tribunals, and they are allowed to rule on substantive rights that are provided to foreign investors under these deals. One of those rights is called the minimum standard of treatment, which has been increasingly interpreted as the right of an investor to push for government compensation if that investor's expectations are not fulfilled. Now, if you would take that seriously, if you would say if any regulation that does not fulfill the investors, that would, as the United States itself has said in its own defense when having to defend itself against one of these investor state claims, it would freeze our ability to regulate in the public interest. That's their quote. And we believe that's the same. And so, like, a lot of this concern that I'm presenting about the regulatory freeze that this deal could promote comes from these concerns with the replication of this investor state chapter, which indeed has already been proposed from this. It's just one last statement on that. the whole premise for having an anomalous extrajudicial process by which you can bypass a domestic court system and have a foreign corporation press a claim against a law of a sovereign government is that the domestic legal system must be too incompetent, ill-equipped, or corrupt to be able to handle such a claim. That it is not really an allegation that I think the United States government would say befits any of the other governments that are involved in these negotiations. All these governments have functioning domestic legal systems, so it's really bizarre that this has been recommended for inclusion under the U.S.-EU deal. These are not claims that are made from the governments trying to expropriate land or factories. These are public interest policies that time and again have been pursued. UNCTAD just came out with a report, I think last week, showing that last year was a record number of these cases being brought under various free trade agreements and bilateral investment treaties. I only bring this up because it really is the cause for much of the concern that this is actually not going to be a mere mutual recognition, as was stated, of regulations on either side of the Atlantic, but rather an opportunity, a backdoor opportunity for big businesses to be able to get the dismantling that they have been pushing for since 1995.
Holy moly, I think we just had our John Dean moment at the Watergate hearings. That's pretty extraordinary. Would anyone like to comment?
The mandate from the European Commission and from the White House does not include this particular proposal by Jeffrey. I doubt that it will sustain itself for the very reasons that you raised. That we have very strong judicial and legal systems in both of these areas, and it just is not something that would be sustained.
Professor Cleeton?
I would add a comment that I think worker protection and investor protection both are important issues. They do have different concerns and bases. Investors do provide funding and capital, which is quite mobile as opposed to labor. So the direction in which worker protection and investor protection operate are in quite different spheres. And those considerations are important.
Yes, please.
I'd like to pick up what David said about the argument, was an argument about the inclusion of non-European airlines in the emissions trading scheme, which, by the way, looks like just about fallen apart as of yesterday. But the sector concern is very interesting and I'd say ominous as far as let's call it a free trade agreement go, because when you get into services, you're getting into things which have two awkward aspects. And I dealt with this with the airline industry for about 5 years, and it's a cautionary tale. One, not necessarily the strongest, is the most important, is that these kinds of service industries are commonly either state-owned or highly protected, some of them on security grounds. So the idea of merging is one that makes governments either resistant or nervous. And that's one thing. And the other thing is to do with the nature of services. The economists often say, if you want to think of a service, how about a haircut? Well, if you want to see the distinction, you would make one between the haircut and, let's say, a hairdryer. Hairdryer is something that you can send across borders and nobody has to go with it. But a haircut, in the nature of it's a bit more, sometimes a bit more subtle than this. But the broad distinction is that a service is something which requires the provider, to the nature that both the provider and the recipient, the customer, be in close physical contact. Now, I'll just take the airlines as a case. If you have an industry which has the first characteristics, namely very protected for security reasons that go back to about 5 years after the Wright brothers, on the one hand, and on the other hand, it is a service. Now, you go into the rocks very quickly when you try to create transatlantic or any cross-border liberalization. And the specific is this, that I'll give you a very particular point of how, example of how grotesque the attempts to get round this are. In the case of the airlines, they very much wanted, particularly European airlines, very much wanted to get into the American market. However, there are regulations to fill the room that restrict the operation of foreign airlines and actually the ownership by foreign airlines of American carriers. That meant, in a broad way, that say Lufthansa could never operate between Pittsburgh and New York. Would actually be quite a happy thing if it did, but it doesn't mean that. It means that that's prohibited. And I was once on a plane actually from here to London, which stopped in Philly, and my hair nearly stood on end when the flight attendant said, "Those of you who are leaving this aircraft at Philadelphia," and I thought, if anybody's leaving this aircraft at Philadelphia, they are breaking international law. Because you're not supposed to carry domestically. So with the airlines, the second best solution to this was to create these alliances. And the alliances are variously regarded as a huge commercial success and a massive piece of consumer deception. And the particular case I'm thinking of, which shows the lengths to which, or the stratagems to which the carriers would resort it, is actually a Pittsburgh case. For several years, this is not very well known, but for several years, because of a whole legal tangle to do with traffic rights, which are negotiated outside of each other, case by case, there was a service from here, Pittsburgh, to London. And the aircraft concerned were, and it was operated by British Airways, the aircraft concerned were painted entirely in British Airways livery. The crew, actually all the crew, particularly the flight attendants, were dressed in British Airways uniforms, and they worked to British Airways protocols. However, the crew was actually a US Airways crew, the plane was actually a US Airways plane, and for purposes of working round the rules on traffic rights, they had to resort to this pantomime, which fell apart about 6 years ago for other reasons. So the point is that if you, with a service industry, it's particularly problematic given the second definition I gave, which is that it's not like pushing things across a border. You want to be where the customer is in order to serve the customer. And as soon as you try to put that into effect, you will run up against the highly protectionist aspect of these industries. And it's frankly, it took 7 years, and I'll finish on this, 7 to 8 years, to get an agreement between the United States and the European Union on the liberalization of the North Atlantic. And it's still not quite, because European carriers cannot operate within the United States. And they were ferociously strong, and there still are interests, particularly labor interests, working against that. That's why they resort to the second best. And the deception of saying, when I am flying from Pittsburgh to Pittsburgh to Washington on something that appears to be an Iberia flight, if not Air Afghanistan, if not something else, it's called code sharing. That's the reason that kind of thing goes on. Certainly, there are other aspects of it. Services are very tough.
I wonder, given the complexities that you just described, if a setting that essentially bundles all of these issues together. Now, I must say, 18 months, given what Martin just said, seems remarkably rapid. Is it possible that there could be forced trading on deals across issues that might make an agreement more likely? Well, Europe gives a little on GMOs, and we give a little on airline traffic. I don't know what these negotiations are like, if that's even possible.
I would say, can I just say briefly to that? I would say that would be extremely difficult because the interests concerned here are very specific and very strong in their own sectors. And I don't think that they're going to be particularly open to trade-offs offered by governments. It's just for encouragement.
I think Martin is right. I think what is not yet done is how this negotiation. We've had lots of discussions about services, about tariffs, non-tariff barriers, regulation. So there are all kinds of technical sides, and then there's the sector. What I see emerging is something organizationally possible. So you have the high-level Transatlantic Regulatory Council, this key U.S. and EU regulators, likely to come together and bring in the industry at that level. You're likely to see the Transatlantic Business Council working with the Chamber of Commerce, maybe the NAM, to come together in the manufacturing and industry and business sector. And within each of those kinds of GEC, also for some of the mutual recognition things. So let me draw an analogy to a negotiation that I did with Blood Diamonds. Interesting. Blood Diamonds is a different subject, but the structure is interesting because what you had there were basically three groups, much smaller than this one, but three groups. You had an industry group, you had an NGO group, and you had government. In the industry, decided that the only way, that is the diamond dealers of the world, and they come from everywhere, the only way that they could negotiate effectively was to come together. So they created the World Diamond Council. Inside the World Diamond Council, they decided what was possible and not possible, and basically managed their participants. In the NGO world, that's a little more difficult to now, but they had been negotiating for about 18 months. When the framework was established, they decided to go off on their own. And they decided that they would demand more things in the legislation in the United States than they had agreed in the negotiations. So in our negotiation, when I came in 2002, we brought them together, sat them down in a room like this and said, if you want to achieve something, then you have to achieve something on the basis of what is achievable. And we already know that in that case. It took a few rounds of discussion, a little bit more discussion among themselves, and they decided that they would put off the things that they could not agree on, like what some of the things that we've been talking about here, services issues or role of GMOs, or those things that were not possible, they would put off to a longer period of time, to a different kind of time frame, not only time frame, but also a different venue. And then came together with governments. Governments then reduced their demands down to one thing, and that was the creation of a certificate of origin. There is, in that sense, you can have, you should look at the way that this comes together. To address these issues that are seemingly intractable, if you negotiate in a series of subcommittees, if you will, and deal with what is manageable, what's doable, then you have a different matrix. You have a different way of actually making this agreement come together in the 18 months that they've set out for themselves.
I'm conscious of the time, and I don't want to extend beyond our already demonstrative exploitation of our guests, but I do want to raise one other somewhat broader set of issues issue that applies. And it is the following: you have the negotiators at the international level from both the United States and Europe, but then of course each one has their domestic constituencies, some of which have been revealed here, but they also have domestic structures that make it impossible for them to shake hands on a deal and go back home and make it stick. Europe is, of course, not fully a supranational organization, and national interests will emerge. In the United States, the president doesn't even have fast-track authority. He cannot even present what a deal emerges as a yes or no vote. But maybe that's less of an issue here. Maybe if these hard issues can be hammered out, then the politics, won't matter. But as a political scientist, I doubt it. So I want to invite our panelists to comment on what you might call the two-level game politics of this. I'll begin with Ben.
Sure. Have I been unmuted now? So I would say that it is critical that these negotiations, since they do implicate a wide swath of regulatory policies, would be that the respective legislatures of the EU and the United States should set binding objectives for the negotiations before they begin, that they should be consulted. we're talking about congressional committees with jurisdiction over such things as emissions controls, with jurisdiction over such things as food safety standards, financial regulation, et cetera. It makes sense and that they should be setting the objectives for these deals. Obviously, some form of authority needs to be delegated, but that authority should be delegated within the bounds set by elected representatives, given the stakes the implications for U.S. domestic policymaking and EU domestic policymaking. Those objectives should be then to measure progress rather than a fast track mechanism by which no binding objectives are set and essentially the deal is signed. Not essentially, literally, the deal is signed by the president before Congress has a chance to vote on it and say, does this meet our standards? The objective should be set at the beginning. Consultations with the legislature should be going on throughout. And then there should be a vote by the legislatures before the deal is signed, so that they can confirm that, yes, indeed, this does meet the benchmark, the standard that we were aiming for. Why I think this is such a critical matter goes back to, it's essentially a difference between what we have been hearing from business in their submitted comments for what this deal should look like, and the picture of this deal that has been presented by Ambassador Bindenagel, which I think is a much prettier picture. And if that is indeed the true picture, then that's great. Instead, to just go back to that investment provisions, it was actually included within the high-level working group's final mandate. The final report of the high-level working group, which is the blueprint for this agreement, that the investment provisions that I mentioned should be included. It says the investment reforms and protection that incorporates the most comprehensive obligations and standards of existing U.S. and EU accords, which is those provisions included in past FTA. So we believe the threat is real. I was just on a panel last week at the Chamber of Commerce of the body you mentioned, the High-Level Regulatory Cooperation Forum, in a panel of 2 days worth of presentations. Consumer groups, environmental groups, labor groups, any groups besides industry were devoted an entire half hour on that panel. This is concerning to us. If this was merely about the mutual recognition of regulatory standards, well, then consumer groups would obviously be in favor of that and should be invited to say, we're in favor of that. Instead, what we heard was presentation after presentation by large industries. The airlines associations obviously were there, talking about the emissions trading scheme of Europe. The other ones I've mentioned for a day and a half gave time and again their bullet points of the regulatory standards, the substantive standards they would like to see weakened, harmonized, so to speak. And these are words that came from them, not words we're planting on them. So if indeed the internal negotiations are somewhat different than that, we're only talking merely about mutual recognition. We're not talking about replicating the extreme investor provisions of prior deals. That is a wholly different accord than what we've been hearing from business that's been pushing this deal again since 1995. And I think this goes back to why I think it's so critical that negotiating objectives be set in advance before and approved by the legislatures before there's a vote, and also why this really should be cast open to the public. I mean, if the negotiating texts are merely mutual recognition of each other's standards, let that be known to the public, and there's not going to be nearly as much contentious about this deal. What we're hearing is not that. What we're hearing is a high ambition by U.S. business to deregulate on the other side of the Atlantic, and that is obviously going to be a concern to us. Until we see texts showing us otherwise, we have to go with what those who are pushing this deal are saying. So I think this joint of what exactly is in this text provides perfect argument for why the negotiating text itself, themselves, and proposals, once they are actually start coming, should be published so that the public can review and comment on them.
David.
I'm going to restrict my comments to what I observe about the marketplaces. The United States is, for the most part, a single market. in goods and services. We've spent decades ago going through the process of interstate bank deregulation. Europe is a single market in many goods. It has been much less successful in becoming a single market in services. That means that there are more heterogeneous interests across nation states in Western Europe. We could only mention the City of London as an example. When you have these different market non-price, non-tariff barriers, you do get cost effects and you get rents effects, where people have protected positions, and therefore they invest in making those rent protections a political agenda. So there will be more heterogeneous set of political tastes and preferences in Western Europe than I think we'll see in the U.S. And it is in the interest of the politicians to figure out who they're representing and whether they're representing the common good that was the founding of the common market, or whether they're interested in promoting some more rounds of interventions that create the or bypass the opportunity to open up, particularly the single market, I think, in services from the outside pressure that will come from the U.S.-EU agreement.
I'm very impressed and interested by what my colleagues have said, and I don't have very much to offer except that, in a way, it's an analogy with administration jobs in universities. At this point, you're getting, I think, what you see in, if you ever have a kind of position in the university or probably any other large organization, which is the reason you're paid some more money, if any, is because you deal with difficult cases, the hard cases. And in this case, it's a sequence, and it's what's left over in this case are going to be difficult and have not been sorted out before, precisely because they are very difficult. And there is going to be a lot of trouble agreeing on some of these. I was very struck, actually prepping for this, going through the Financial Times, by how quickly what I call the usual suspects appeared in the last week. What I mean by the usual suspects are the people who are very determined to defend whichever aspect of sovereignty it is against in a kind of preemptive strike. So we had the French Minister of Trade, who came out very quickly to say that particularly don't touch l'exception culturelle, which is to say all their efforts to protect French cinema and the French intellectual legacy against Hollywood, etc., and other things. And there were other people came out like this. So there is quite a lot of position taking and warning off going on the part of people who are interests which have appeared before and which are really fairly well dug in, I would say. So the general comment you hear, if you read up about this over the last year or so, the phrase that keeps on coming up is no low-hanging fruit. The low-hanging fruit is a kind of flip side of what we're saying there. The low-hanging fruit have already been plucked and consumed to some extent. So it looks like there are going to be some useful but not enormous gains across the board that may help with the jobs, but there are some very naughty things there which I suspect won't get any further because we didn't get far with them before. So that's a limited. But
Ambassador Bindenagel, since I called on you first, I'll give you the last one.
Thank you. I like what Martin has just said. What we're dealing with, and Ben, what you've been talking about, is that process identifying where the really hard cases are and the individual company or individual group's interests. That's very important in the process. But I would suggest that if you really want to get to the next level, you should take a look at two things. One is the letter from USTR to Speaker Boehner that outlines exactly where U.S. government mandate is, where the U.S. government negotiating mandate is now in the House of Representatives, is waiting for commentary in the public and in the elected representatives to come. Once that mandate is approved, then the negotiation can begin. A similar process is happening in Europe. The EU DG Trade has proposed their mandate, the Commission's mandate, and that's actually on the web, so they leaked it already, so everybody can also see that. It's gone to the Council of Ministers. Council of Ministers will be meeting in May, and they will approve or not approve, or whatever. They will modify whatever the mandate is for Carl de Roux. At that point, both legislative, or in the case of the Europeans, the national governments have given the negotiators their mandate. They can't go outside that mandate. They can listen to all these other problems and issues and concerns. They will have to determine how much they can negotiate or not negotiate, how they structure the negotiations. And then that you'll see probably, at least as people, what I've been hearing is that the announcement for this agreement to begin, or the negotiation to begin, will be on the fringes of the UK-hosted, Northern Ireland-hosted G8 summit. So you have a process that is beginning, and you will have lots of discussion in the Financial Times, in the Chamber of Commerce, in other places. Everyone will try to put their position on the table and make sure that they have the best position. I will note that, Ben, what you have mentioned about harmonization and mutual recognition of standards, this is a very critical and important point, particularly for small and medium-sized industry. The reason we don't have a lot of American companies in Europe is because of the problems of trying to deal with regulations. American companies that are small are not interested in fighting all of these battles. If that can be overcome, then we will see a greater investment, a greater participation in the market by small and medium-sized companies in the United States. That's where the growth will be. It won't be in the big companies, and they will make money as their own. It's in the small and medium-sized industry. Actually,
thank you, Will. We began on the subject of growth and trade, and we end there. And let me take this opportunity to heartily thank my panelists. And by the way, Professor Laïdi from Sciences Po did not abandon us. He was apparently forced to evacuate because of an alarm de feu, which made him leave the building, and where we regret that he wasn't able to join us. He didn't just walk out the door. And we hope he's okay, by the way. But I want to thank David Cleeton from Illinois State, Ben Beachy from Public Citizen for joining us and participating so vigorously, as well as my colleague Martin Staniland from ISPIA and Ambassador Bindenagel, who came to Pittsburgh and had no idea what he was getting into. So on behalf of all of us, I want to thank you. See you next year for our next. Thanks.